Mitt Romney for president again isn't such a crazy idea. Two years can be a lifetime in politics. It was in April of 2012 that the aide deputized by Mitt Romney to lead his search for a running mate reported back to him with a list of 11 names. And Paul Ryan was on that list, and so was Chris Christie and Marco Rubio and a few other names, and also the governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell. And it made perfect sense that McDonnell would be on that list. Virginia is a big state. It's a crucial swing state. McDonnell enjoyed an approval rating of well over 60%. He delivered a response to the State of the Union address. Of course, Romney didn't end up picking Bob McDonnell in 2012. He chose Paul Ryan instead. But that only started a different kind of chatter about the Virginia governor. What about the White House in 2016 if Romney loses in 2012? But then came the allegations that a shady Virginia businessman had plied McDonnell and his wife with tens of thousands of dollars in gifts and cash. Then the federal investigation, the end of his term as governor, months of legal limbo, then the trial, and now this week, the emphatic final chapter of the Bob McDonnell story. Guilty verdicts, 11 of them on federal corruption charges. There's a lot to be said about Bob McDonnell, but from a political standpoint, it's actually very easy. It's over. He has no political future. And that reality is directly related to an argument I'm about to make that I know will make a lot of people roll their eyes. But here it is anyway. I think the talk about Mitt Romney running for president again in 2016 is kind of serious, actually. Makes a lot more sense than most people instinctively think it does. And I know, he's already lost. He's already lost twice. He had all those wealth gaffes, the 47% tape, all of that stuff. Surely the Republican Party could do better than that, right? Well, that's the thing. I'm not so sure they can, and I'm not so sure they think they can either. Bob McDonnell was part of the reason why. He was a very logical 2016 candidate 2 years ago. Now he's a scratch. And there's Chris Christie. He was going to be the favorite. Now he's in Bridgegate limbo. Marco Rubio was going to be a rising star, but he's taking a pummeling on the right for reading the immigration tea leaves the wrong way. Are you seeing a pattern here? There are some Republicans who are very eager to run in 2016. Rand Paul is out there, Ted Cruz too, Mike Huckabee's making noise, Rick Santorum as well. But they're all candidates of the base. What about the candidate of the establishment? The one who all the elected officials and interest groups and money people rally around, and who ends up being just acceptable enough to the base. Here's a recent poll of the prospective GOP candidates from New Hampshire, the first in the nation primary state. No one's running away with it. Not much excitement about any of these candidates individually. Now add Romney's name. Look at that. It's a blowout. And it's not just New Hampshire. Here's Iowa without Romney. And now here it is with him again. Not even close. And look closely, because both of those polls do include Jeb Bush, whose name is just as big as Romney's, and who sent a signal this week that he's very interested in potentially playing that establishment candidate role in 2016. But Romney is crushing Bush in both of those key early states. Look, I'm not saying those numbers would necessarily hold if Romney gets in, or that he'll beat Hillary Clinton in a general election. But these numbers, I think, should make you pause for a minute. Because one knock on the idea of Romney running is that he would just be another Michael Dukakis or Walter Mondale or some other losing candidate running again. But Dukakis and Mondale were blown out when they ran. Romney won 24 states. And remember, losing candidates have gone on to win before. It took Nixon 2 campaigns to get it right. It took Ronald Reagan 3 tries. Maybe you like Mitt Romney, maybe you don't like Mitt Romney. But when you hear about him possibly running again in 2016, my advice would be to not dismiss it quite so quickly. Here to tell me if I'm right, wrong, or crazy, or maybe some combination of all of them, we have Stephen Moore from the Heritage Foundation, as well as Roll Call Editor-in-Chief Christina Bellantoni, and MSNBC political analyst Joe Walsh is back at the table with us. Steve Moore, more than anybody at this table, you live in the world I'm talking about, so I'm going to start with you. The case I just made, what's your reaction to it?
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Steve. Actually, I think every argument you made for Mitt Romney is the argument that establishment Republicans are making. And when I talk to a lot of the people who are part of that establishment, they say, look, who else is there? Now, I'll tell you, the one guy who would sort of stand in his way is Jeb Bush. Everybody's kind of waiting for Jeb to see what decision that he makes, and he would be, a big challenger to Romney for that kind of establishment, big money any support. But a couple of reasons why what you're saying, Steve, is not crazy. One is, when I talk to Republicans, they're looking at these polls, you've seen them, that if the election were held today, Mitt Romney would win over Barack Obama in a landslide, and that has a lot of Republicans salivating. So there is a lot of support for me. He could raise a lot of money right out of the gate, but I would make the case there are a lot of, I mean, this is going to be a field probably of a dozen Republicans, people like Rick Perry, people like Mike Pence, people like Rand Paul, and the only reason that Mitt Romney's way up in those polls is because he's the guy that people have heard of.
I thought that, but then when they've heard of Jeb Bush, and there's Jeb Bush sitting in that poll at 6%, and Mitt Romney's up at 35%. But Christina, have you seen a situation like this? Because the people say, oh, it'd be another Dukakis, it'd be another Mondale. Dukakis and Mondale weren't polling at 35-40% a couple years after they lost.
I actually compared this more to what happened with Al Gore, right? It was sort of this, oh, Al Gore was right. We didn't give Al Gore enough of a chance. This was a sentiment among Democrats, come 2002, 2003, 2004. And so that's why he was atop all of those polls, even with names like Hillary Clinton in the mix at the time. And, obviously John Kerry ended up becoming the nominee. So, and then think about, it's not all that different from Hillary Clinton now, right? Democrats are strongly considering and strongly favor going back to the person who did not win a primary and who wouldn't necessarily be like the end-all be-all, I'm going to win 80% of the presidential vote if I run in the general election. And so it's not impossible at all. The infrastructure is there. The other thing about Jeb Bush, we spend a lot of time talking about him and following what he's doing, but he's not a national figure anymore in the way that Mitt Romney was. He just ran for president.
Right. No, it's true. The last time I think Jeb Bush actually ran in an election would be 2002. So that's, 12 years ago. I can do math. It's 12 years ago.
You can do it.
But so, Joe, I mean, looking at this from your perspective, I mean, I guess I'm sure Democrats would love to run against Mitt Romney again.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I have mocked it in the past, but I think that the case that you laid out is very clear. He would be a strong candidate. I don't think anybody should take comfort in polls showing that voters would elect him again if faced with Barack Obama. The president's had a tough summer, and he's not on the ballot. So that, you have to be looking at what he would do against a Hillary Clinton, but you would have two establishment figures. He wouldn't be running against somebody brand new. So they have to take it seriously. But it really is a sign of weakness in the party that they have not produced another establishment figure. There's a Rand Paul, there's a Ted Cruz. They could be formidable with the base, but that this establishment is out of gas. I mean, Christie's in trouble. Scott Walker gets mentioned. He might not even get reelected in Wisconsin. So there's something really broken here if you're going to go back to a Mitt Romney for a third try.
That is true. That there is no clear favorite. I mean, this is the first time in 50 years, Steve, that there is no clear favorite for the Republicans. I've never seen that in my lifetime. So, but look at the Democrats. I mean, look at people like Bill Clinton. Look at people like Barack Obama. I mean, nobody would have predicted that they were going to merge on the big stage the way they did. And so, the fact that there's no clear front runner for the Republican, I don't think that's a big problem. The worry about Mitt Romney that I hear is that the voters have rejected him. That there's this kind of likability factor that he doesn't face. And when you talk about Romney being the Republican, potentially being the Republican nominee in 2016, who I think of? Adlai Stevenson. It didn't work out too well for him.
No, that's not a comparison he likes. But let me ask you this, though, Steve. Like, is there an indication? I mean, just in signals maybe Mitt Romney is sending behind the scenes among conservatives, among Republicans? Is there an indication he's interested in this at all?
Absolutely, yes. I don't think there's any question he wants to run. I think he would like to be drafted, as the kind of, the guy who can beat Hillary. So I think there's any question that Mitt Romney wants to be president.
That's amazing to me, Christina.
Well, you think if you want to be president once, that doesn't ever go away. Again, Hillary Clinton is my example. And you see a lot of the political consultant world or operatives that didn't love him or maybe worked for another candidate in the primaries increasingly saying, well, maybe he was right, or maybe there were things about his campaign that weren't quite ripe for the time, but now, given the president being so unpopular, of course he's going to top a re-election that'll never happen or another vote that would never happen. Right. So that is just another thing that when you think the guy can raise the money, he's already got a presence in a lot of these states, his blessing, I don't think he's going to run. but none of it is impossible. His blessing is going to mean a lot when it comes to the ultimate Republican governor.
Well, and Joan, you were getting into this a minute ago too. It's it's the psychology of the base of a party, the psychology of the base of the Republican Party. If they're sort of devoutly anti-Obama, and you see a poll like Steve's talking about that says, "Hey, Mitt Romney would win the rematch today,"
right.
They don't want to hear the qualifiers you're saying. It's vindication of their long-held belief.
Yeah, and I also think we're in a different place with the Tea Party and with the very conservative wing of the base. It's still strong. We can't write it out.
That's for sure.
Write it off. But there's a sense that there's disarray over on that side, that there are several Tea Party folks who who seem like they're going to run. They'll split that vote. And I think that I mean, again, I'm with Christina. If you ask me to bet on it, I would bet not. But if he wants to do it, I think he also knows what he did wrong last time, 47%, and coming off like the guy.
Right. Sweep the room for microphones and cameras before you speak.
Maybe talk a little differently.
Steve Moore, before we go, just a quick answer. If you could put a percent on it, what do you think? What's the chance that Mitt Romney runs?
I think it's a coin flip, and the issue, if Romney wins, his mandate and his attraction will be one word after this president: competency. That he is competent, that he can do the job, and people feel like maybe the guy in the White House right now isn't so competent.
And again, that's the question: how that resonates with the Republican base after 8 years of President Obama. My thanks to the Heritage Foundation, Steve Moore, for joining us this morning. Appreciate that. Still ahead, a former 6-term mayor who's gone to prison and is trying to win his old job back. As political comebacks go, this one would be extraordinary. The most interesting mayoral candidate in America joins us next.